before I introduce our first speaker, I want to mention to you that there is an exhibit over at the library of the School of Theology and Ministry, atrium there, right on campus, which is right across Commonwealth. It sounds far away, but it's right across Commonwealth where we are. And it's entitled, Whoever Saves a Single Life, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust. And it's the traveling exhibit of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, which is based in New York City. And it's a wonderful institution which has a double mission. On one hand, it provides monthly financial support for those rescuers who are needy. And many of them, of course, are very elderly at this point. And the other mission is to preserve the legacy of rescuers through its educational program. For those of you who will be in Boston, there will be an open reception at 5 p.m. on Monday. And the director of the Foundation for the Righteous will be there opening the visit. Stalin Saul. Our first speaker today is Dr. Mordecai Paltiel, whom I first met at the Oxford Conference way back in 1988 on the Holocaust. It's a pleasure to welcome him back to Boston College because he was here for a Yom HaShoah event a few years ago. And so it's good to see familiar faces back here. In at least two ways, he's at the origin of our conference. First, and this is on a local level, when I was in Yad Vashem a number of years ago working on the rescuers, I ran across a letter, and it was from Dr. Padilla. I told him I'd have a surprise for him. And it was a letter to a priest who had raised with Dr. Padilla the issue of some recognition for an individual. And just to quote the letter, I hope it's not unethical. Permitting on this occasion to inquire that what, if anything, the Catholic Church has done to perpetuate the memory of some of the clergy who were honored with the righteous title. In particular, I have in mind Father Jacob Raleigh of the Society of Jesus, who received the righteous title following information received by you. Has any Catholic institution, classroom, hallway, or other been named in memory of this brave person? Is his name to be consigned only to gather dust in the archives of Yad Vashem? Or is this Good Samaritan as well as the other Catholic clergy in our files to serve as role models for Christian youth in generations to come? And invitation. That came up yesterday in the discussion about pedagogy. And I mentioned yesterday on the panel, Father Jacob Raleigh was buried out in our cemetery, the cemetery here in Weston, because he fled Hungary after the communist takeover and died in a car crash here in the Boston area, or New Jersey, shortly after. And I'm happy to say we will affix a plaque to his grave in the spring, announcing that we can honor Israel state of dead. So we're beginning at the beginning and responding to your question. The second reason why Dr. Padilla is at the origin of our conference is that for many, many years he was director of the Department of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, and nobody knows the archive. He's also currently, he retired from that position a few years ago, and currently is a lecturer at Yeshiva University and Queens College in New York. He was born in Belgium, and he and his family fled to France, where they were rescued by a Catholic priest who was able to smuggle the entire family to Switzerland. Dr. Padilla is one of the leading authorities on the rescuers whom we've been looking at yesterday and today. He's written several books, including The Path of the Righteous, Gentile Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust, Whoever Saves One Life, The Uniqueness of the Righteous Among the Nations, Sheltering the Jews, Stories of Holocaust Rescuers and German Rescuers of Jews, Individuals versus the System. In 1991, Dr. Padilla was the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar of Holocaust Studies at the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey. He received his bachelor's degree from Hebrew University and then went on for a master's and PhD in religion and Holocaust studies at Temple University. His presentation explores one of the most challenging areas of research, which came up yesterday in discussion among the rescuers, namely the Germans and their particular relationship to the task of rescue. His lecture is entitled, Defining Their Own Regime, German Rescuers of Jews. So please join me in welcoming Dr.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Many persons are surprised to learn that other than Oskar Schindler, whose story was celebrated in a mass popular film, there were to be found other Germans, though not in large numbers, who equally took risk upon themselves to save Jews from the Nazi regime. Here I should like to enlarge on this point of other Germans in various stations of life who also extended help to Jews on their own. Most of my talk is based on files at Yad Vashem, where some 650 Germans and Austrians, and I mention Austrians because Austria was part of Germany during the period of my investigation, that is from 1938 to 45. 650 of these Germans were awarded the prestigious Righteous title by Yad Vashem. The result of my sample of some 135 rescue cases involving some 200 rescuers out of the 650 showed that approximately a third of all rescue stories recorded at Yad Vashem originated in the Berlin metropolitan area, where most Jews in Germany lived, another third in other localities inside Germany and Austria, and the final third in countries under German occupation, mostly in Poland. Interestingly, most rescue operations took the form of hiding in the rescuer's home occurred rather inside Germany, whereas in the occupied territories, the most prevalent form of help was using all sorts of subterfuge vis-à-vis the authorities, such as claiming that the Jewish labor assigned to them was vital for the prosecution of the war effort, as in the Oskar Schindler story. Also of interest, many of the rescue operations inside Germany involved persons who either knew each other before the war or entertained some kind of business relationship, whereas when we moved to rescue stories in the occupied territories or inside camps, most of the rescue operations there are of rescuers and rescue who met only recently during the war years, but in many cases had time to be in close and extended proximity to each other. Time permitting, I will demonstrate some of these case stories. For rescuers and rescuers who knew each other from before, we have in Berlin, for instance, Johanna Eck. Her help to both to this girl, Mia Gutmann, and to Heinz Gutmann. It all began as a result of a previous acquaintance, but not with the rescued person, but with the person's late father. Heinz's father, Heinz Gutmann, was a comrade in arms of Johanna Eck's husband during World War I. When Johanna's father was mortally wounded in battle, he died in the arms of his Jewish friend, who immediately saw to his temporary burial. Presently, the Jewish soldier's son, Heinz, was in need of immediate help, and Johanna afforded him temporary shelter in her home, and then she extended that to other people, including to this girl, Frieda Gutmann, no relations to Heinz Gutmann. She stayed about a dozen Jews in her home. Further south in Vienna, we have the story of Dorothea Neff, a noted stage actress. She sheltered in her home for over 3 years a former dress designer, Lily Wolf, who had designed the stage costumes when both previously resided in Cologne. While sheltering the forlorn Jewish woman in her home, Dorothea Neff continued her stage appearances, even appearing before troops in distant places. A pre-war romance could naturally also lead to a rescue operation, such in the case of Maria von Malzahn, a veterinarian who became romantically linked with Hans Hirschel, and the editor of an avant-garde literary journal. She sheltered him in her Berlin home from 1942, February 42 onward, even bearing him a son while he was in hiding. She then also enlisted in other rescue operations involving Jews and Mischlinge, that is, less than full Jews by Nazi definition, in coordination with the Swedish church in Berlin. And her sister was married to Field Marshal von Eichner, a Nazi general who commanded German troops in the Ukraine, and issued a proclamation that the fight against the Jews is such an important object for the Reich. So that was her brother-in-law, and she was sheltering a Jew in her home. Finally, but still in Berlin, we have Elisabeth Abeck. She was mostly prompted by her Quaker belief to extend help to her former Jewish pupils. A teacher by profession, she was dismissed from a school post by the newly appointed Nazi school principal in the early 1930s. In the 1940s, she helped many of her former Jewish pupils during the height of the Nazi persecution. They would gather in her home for Friday evening meals, and some she aided in facilitating the attempted flight to Switzerland. As for help arranged through third parties, we present the story of the Jewish Margot Bloch, who met her rescuers, the Kochanowski family, in Hanover in May 1943, through the good offices of a Jewish woman married to a non-Jew. Margot Bloch stayed with the Kochanowski family intermittently by taking care of the small children. To outsiders, she was presented as the wife of a soldier away in the military. Occasionally she traveled with the Kochanowskis to the Harz Mountains on family outings, and she stayed with him to the end of the war. She has a new name, Margaret Arnold, and she lives in Melbourne, Australia, where I had the pleasure of meeting her. There were also a few cases of Germans who tried to save individual Jews whom they had randomly and accidentally met during the war years, and had time to get to know them a bit better. Not as forced laborers, but on a person-to-person basis. As in the following story, Henry Lachs met his future rescuer, Otto Nuremberg, when the latter moved Henry's furniture into a Jewish home in Berlin, when Lachs was forced to relocate under Nazi orders. In the course of the next month, Henry escaped several deportation raids. Then, left with no other recourse in February 1943, he called again upon Nuremberg, who earlier impressed him as a decent person. This time, Otto Nuremberg decided to hide him in a shaft covered by a disabled van for the next 2 years. To repeat, the two had earlier accidentally met when Nuremberg was asked by Henry Lachs to move his belongings to a new place. This face-to-face encounter blossomed later into a full-fledged rescue operation. As for Ellen Brockman, she was a professional singer with a musical band that performed before soldiers. And on one of these tours, she met fellow musician Konrad Latte in 1944, with whom she became romantically involved. He was posing as a non-Jew. When she revealed his true identity, she kept the secret to herself and shielded him from suspicious rumors and glances by other musicians in the band. When the band was disbanded by Joseph Goebbels in 1944, the two moved to a place where Konrad, the man you see here sitting next to her, continued his musical performances, including religious recitals in churches. This until the end of the war. They then married. What you see on the screen, you see her planting a tree at Yad Vashem. I now come to help involving persons in mixed marriages, that is, Jews with non-Jews, as well as Mischlinge, the Nazi term for persons with half or a quarter Jewish blood, as well as cases of baptized Jews, that is, who converted to Christianity, but were by Nazi definition Jewish, since they were born Jewish or had parents or grandparents of Jewish origin. These persons were termed by the regime as non-Aryan Christians. Jews married to non-Jewish spouses faced severe restrictions, but were initially spared deportation. In fact, their status was more privileged than the Mishmagim, the Jews with so-called mixed blood, and their status was even better than fully baptized Jews, who by Nazi definition were considered full-fledged Jews if they had 3 Jewish grandparents. In the mixed marriages, the married Jewish spouses were spared, but only for as long as they remained married. In February 1943, the Nazi leadership tried to deport the Jewish men married to non-Jewish women. But after a huge demonstration lasting into many days by the non-Jewish wives in front of the building where the man had been taken, the famous Rosenstrasse incident, and this is like a reenactment in film of what took place, the Nazis, fearing repercussions by other would-be demonstrators, relented and decided to release the Jewish husbands. There's now a monument there nearby of Rosenstrasse for these brave non-Jewish German spouses, women who stood and shouted, "Release our husbands," and the order came from Hitler to free the Jewish husbands in the back home. He didn't want a demonstration by Aryan women on the Berlin street in February 43 with newspapers from neutral countries, and he didn't want to give the order to open fire on the streets of Berlin to non-Jewish Aryan women. These men were spared deportation thanks to the public stand of their courageous non-Jewish spouses. The regime postponed any further actions against Jewish spouses until late 1944, and by then, some had had ample time to see the handwriting on the wall and make plans to go into hiding. Jewish women married to non-Jewish men were in a slightly better position vis-à-vis the regime than the reverse, Jewish men married to non-Jewish women. But here too, these Jewish wives also found themselves on the run late in the Nazi period, as in the following story. In Kassel, Pastor Walter Dizenkalter, that you see here, admitted to his home in early 45 for household chores a woman claiming to be a refugee from the bombings. He soon suspected otherwise, that she was Jewish, but he kept this to himself. After the war's end, he learned that she was married to a non-Jewish dentist. In order to protect him from police interrogation, when in early 45 Jewish women's spouses were also rounded up, she had left a fabricated suicide note behind and fled to nearby Kassel. You have 2 pictures of her in 1915 and 18 as a nurse, and in 1944 with her non-Jewish husband. After the war, the kindly pastor thereupon informed the woman's husband of his wife's presence, and the couple was happily reunited. In other words, here you have a Jewish woman married to a non-Jewish man, and she was spared deportations until late 44, early 45, and then when she realized that they were going to get her, the Nazi regime decided to round up these people too, but she was considered fully Jewish. You can see on her previous, you can see on her previous ID card, she had a big J, which means she was Jewish, and she was sheltered and fled. We continue with examples of Mishlim, that is persons with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents who felt threatened with deportation and sought help from others. If you have 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents and 2 so-called Aryan grandparents, then you are considered a Mishlinger. Grade A with 2 and 2. Grade B if you only had 1 Jewish grandparent. They make a difference who you were today. You could have been a fascist or a Nazi or anything. If you had 3 Jewish grandparents, you are Jewish. If you had 2 Jewish grandparents, you are Mishlinger. Such as the story of Adolf Althoff. He owned a circus where he hid Irene Losch, that's the woman standing there on the left, half-Jewish former circus rope jumper, and he had, including a sister and fully Jewish mother, a family who once operated the circus on their own, and knew Althoff as a colleague circus operator. While there, from 1941 to the war's end, Irene fell in love with another circus worker, Peter Stone, that you see standing next to her, who appeared as part of a trio clown group and bore him 2 children, but could not marry him until the war's end. Irene's non-Jewish father, a soldier on the Russian front, was sent home to divorce his Jewish wife. Instead, he deserted and also went into hiding. Irene's other relatives, grandmother, uncle, and aunt, unfortunately were not as fortunate and perished in the Holocaust. Turning to baptized Jews, treated by the Nazis as full-fledged Jews, unless they were Michigan, and they stood in danger of immediate deportation, we know the story of Esther Seidel, who helped the Wolfenstein sisters, Valerie and Andrea, whom she had befriended much earlier, and who had opted out of Judaism many years before the Nazi period. Interestingly, in a post-war statement, Esther Seidel, whom we see here planting a tree at Yad Vashem, she explained her motivation as follows. She's a mother, and her husband was working for Volkswagen company, and she had children. She said the following: during the 30s, it was often discussed how one should react. I then said, I will not place myself on Potsdamer Place and shout that I was against the persecution of the Jews, so as not to destroy my family. As the mother of small children, I was not able to do such a thing. However, should it involve my friend Valerie Wolfenstein, I would then be prepared to risk something. And that shows that proximity and relationship, knowledge of each other from before was a trigger and could help in the person making the move to try to save. Ask for help to Jewish children. These proved quite isolated cases in Germany, for the simple reason that with the start of the mass deportation to Polish camps in September 1941, although there were a few localized deportations before then, many of the Jewish children had already made their escape years before, when emigration was still an open possibility. Thousands left in various ways, such as to Palestine, under the auspices of the Zionist Youth Aliyah program, and thousands of others left for England under the Kindertransport program. This then may be the reason why so few stories, by comparison with other countries, have come to light on the rescue of Jewish children. Following are several such stories involving small children. For months, Kurt Reich and his wife, I'll explain later on what you see, had wandered the streets of Berlin, fleeing from one place to another, with their daughter, Monica, born in December 1942 in Berlin. When in February 43 they felt totally exhausted from trying to stay on the run as a united family, Mrs. Reich was referred by a third party to the Schroeder family. These are the 2 people on the left. Placing the child in their custody, Mrs. Reich was about to leave when Mrs. Schroeder suggested that the couch in the living room could accommodate an additional person. When Ursula Reich replied that she was not alone, her husband was also involved to join. The rescued family, including the infant girl Monica, remained united and in the care of Hedwig and Otto Schroeder throughout the last 2 years of the war, while their son was away in the army fighting Germany's enemies. An unusual phenomenon for the few Jews in a similar predicament. Incidentally, I have already added up over a dozen, maybe 2 dozen stories of Germans who sheltered Jews, while someone in their family was in the army fighting the war. They were soldiers. Either the husband was away, or the son, or someone, and they were sheltering Jews in their homes. And when these soldiers learned that their families were sheltering Jews, they did not object. They felt, I'm talking about soldiers in the Wehrmacht, in the German army. Little Monica is today a teacher in Livingston, New Jersey, and I invited her before my class at Drew University when I taught her, and she spoke about the story of her rescue, and she also spoke about the province in New Jersey. So this is Monica Bloomberg and me a few years ago in Drew University. In Berlin, likewise, in December 42, the pregnant Ruth Abraham, on the left, was on her way to her forced labor assignment in a pharmaceutical firm when she noticed a woman following her. Suspecting a black male attempt, she turned around and politely asked the woman to stop trailing her. To Ruth's surprise, the strange lady replied that this being close to Christmas, and noticing Ruth's advanced pregnancy, she wondered whether she could be of help. Ruth did not believe her ears. As it turned out, a lady named Maria Nickel, that's the lady next to Ruth, supplied Mrs. Abraham and her husband with fresh foodstuff and arranged for the baby to be born in her own house and cared for her for a while the child's parents began a life on the run. They were indeed among the few fortunate ones for both parents, together with the infant child, to survive the Holocaust on German soil. The former Little Veta is today a resident of Cedarhurst, Long Island. Some other isolated cases of children rescue places of rescue took place paradoxically inside camps. Wilhelm Hamann, a political prisoner in Buchenwald, he was an avowed communist. He was charged with by the SS to look after the arrivals from other camps, including, strangely enough, Jewish children. He then took it upon himself to rescue the Jewish children in block number 8 by carefully training them to mingle with the non-Jewish boys, and when asked about their origin to state they were Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Slovaks, anything but Jewish. And the final roll call on April 11, 1945, hours before the camp's liberation, the SS berated him for covering up the true identity of the children under his supervision and threatened reprisals. Soon thereafter, the alarm sounded, and moments later, American tanks rolled into the camp, which in the meantime was already under the control of the camp underground. Hamann had saved the children in the nick of time at great risk to himself. One of these children, Israel Meirlau, is currently the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Jaffa. And here is a list, a partial list, the beginning of a list of the children under the supervision of Wilhelm Hamann. We presently I'd like to turn to rescuers and rescued who met during the war years under conditions of supervisor and worker relationship. This especially took place in countries occupied by Germany, and the majority of such cases have their beginning in work relationships created right there and then, in the midst of the war years. In most such cases, it involved a German entrepreneur or government-appointed administrator, known as Treuhänder, of an expropriated firm, and the forced Jewish labor placed at his disposal. During a relatively short span, usually between 1 and 2 years, in some cases, special bonds of kinship and care evolved between the German supervisor and his Jewish workers, whose lives very much depended on his goodwill. In those limited instances, when work administrators decided to intervene to save their Jewish workers, the number of persons affected, that is momentarily saved, could run into the hundreds and even more. This type of rescue was made possible by the use of subterfuge, of pretending to act in the best interest of the Reich as a facade, a sort of charade, to cover the real intent, which was helping Jewish workers and personnel under their supervision to survive the murderous onslaught of their own regime. Here, the outcome of the rescue operation was bound not by secrecy, that is, such as keeping a fleeing Jewish person hidden in a secretive place, but by successfully contriving all sorts of palatable excuses to justify the bare and open presence of one's Jewish workers. The common explanation used by work administrators who wished to save their Jewish labor was that these workers were vital for the war effort. Or seen from an opposite perspective, the removal of these workers, that is, their killing, would seriously hamper and cause injury to an important war-related project. Such ruses proved in most cases only partially effective, that Their bosses were able to pull the wool over the eyes of the SS and the Gestapo and postpone the murder of their workers, but only for a certain time. The name of the game was cunning and subterfuge, successfully arguing that the keeping of unproduced labor over a longer period of time than originally planned was not in any way related to their rescue, but had an underlying ulterior motive, the greater interest of the Reich, as in the following examples. Bertolt Weiss administered a major oil-producing firm in Boryslav, Poland, today Ukraine, where he employed over 1,000 Jewish workers from the nearby ghetto, most of whom were far from qualified for this specialized type of work. He intervened to save them from deportation for as long as possible, sometimes by bribing the local Gestapo head. Weitz's haggling and procrastination with the SS and Gestapo personnel played off well, as it affected a stay in the killing of his workers for a period of 2 years. He managed to offset Nazi demands to turn over the Jews to him for deportation to the death camp by claiming that his over 1,000 workers were essential for the proper functioning of his oil refineries, although most of these workers had no previous proper training in the operation of such machinery. This lasted until July 1944, when due to the approaching front, most of the workers were taken away and deported to camps further west. Some made a run for the forest to link up with partisan units until the arrival of the ever-advancing Soviet army. When the curtain finally came down on his oil firm, many of his Jewish laborers had made good their escape, some by finding shelter in private homes, while others, as I mentioned, by joining up with the partisans. Also worth mentioning is the story of Hermann Grebe, a civilian engineer assigned by a German firm assigned in Stolbunov, Ukraine, in charge of the railroad facilities there. His argument against eliminating his large Jewish workforce was that they were needed for the proper maintenance of the railroad facilities. Certainly, an important war-related function for keeping supplies rolling for the German army. Killing his workers, he argued, meant that he could not meet contract deadlines with the military. Placing himself in considerable jeopardy, he used this excuse to face an adamant local SS commander during a violent roundup of Jews in nearby Rovno to forcibly free a group of Jews about to be taken away to be shot. He testified at the Nuremberg trial against some of the SS, and after the war he moved to the United States. And here on the left you see the obituary from the New York Times in 1963 where he died in California. And on the right is from the Israeli press when he came to Israel to plant a tree. Of course, in the art of subterfuge, Oskar Schindler excelled above all, by the use of his characteristic unorthodox method of bluffing his way through the highest channels with the help of bribes, coupled with the maximum use of his jovial personality. First, though, in order to maximize the profits as a private entrepreneur, producing pots and pans for the German army in occupied Krakow. Then, to save over 1,000 of his numerous Jewish workers. The wealth he amassed in the operation of an Ineno factory in Krakow, producing mostly pots and pans for the German army, afforded him the easy and luxurious lifestyle to which he aspired, but also allowed him to bribe Nazi and SS officials to exact better privileges for his constantly growing Jewish workforce. Conditions in his factory were good beyond description. He claimed, of course, that by treating well his workers, they were producing more efficiently. When the plant was closed due to the advancing front, he succeeded in convincing, with the help of bribery, top Nazi officials to convert his plant as an ammunition-producing factory and relocate it in Brünnlitz, in mountainous Bohemia, supposedly as a protection against Allied air bombings. There he assembled 1,200 men and women who during an 8-month-long period produced nothing worth of value, and he protected their lives from the ravages of the SS. He had single-handedly saved 1,200 persons through a combination of wild, lies, charm, and lining the pockets of those on whose goodwill he counted. As a master in the art of subterfuge, guile, and deceit, coupled with a strong dose of guts and audacity, all these laced with a human touch, he had no equal. His Jewish wars all survived. All of the 1,200 survived, and incomparable feat in those days, all by a single person, with some help by his wife Emily, especially in the Bundes phase. Similar aid conditions also prevailed in work installations in Germany proper, where a few Jewish labor supervisors lent a hand in trying to save their workers. In Berlin, Otto Veit, who was partially blind, that's the man sitting there on the picture, the left picture to the right, operated a brush and broom manufacturing firm employing many semi and fully blind Jews. Similar to some of his fellow colleagues in Eastern Poland who used Jewish labor at the time, he protected his workers from deportation on the pretext that they were essential to meet order deadlines for his product by the military, brushes and brooms. When once the Gestapo raided his workers while he was away, he made his way to the Gestapo offices in Berlin and stubbornly insisted to release his workers, dumbfounded by the sight of a semi-blind Aryan confronting the Gestapo. The Gestapo, persons who held power over life and death over German citizens, they nevertheless relented and allowed him to take his men back to the factory. Eventually, they were later all deported. He had tried to save them for as long as possible, with the excuse that they were needed to fulfill order assignments with the German military. In the case of the Wehrmacht sergeant, Anton Schmidt, his behavior went much further than merely attending to the needs and safety of his Jewish workers, but to a full identification with his wards, going so far as to assist him militarily against his own people. Sergeant Anton Schmidt was stationed in Vilnius, Lithuania, where he was assigned to assist German soldiers returning from furlough with momentary accommodation until they had rejoined their units. In that capacity, he used, for various work-related needs, Jewish labor from the city ghetto. Witnessing at close hand the brutalities of the Nazis, especially the massacres in the nearby Panera Forest, he decided to throw his lot with Jewish underground operatives inside the Vilna ghetto. This including hosting them in his home, transporting them in his military vans from place to place, and even providing them with weapons. Betrayed and arrested, he was court-martialed and executed in April 42. Before the execution, you can read the letter that he wrote to his wife in Vienna. I will read a few passages. My dear Steffi, I'm informing you, my dearest, that my verdict has been announced today, and that I must part from this world. I am sentenced to death. Please forgive me. I did not want to cause you this pain, but unfortunately it cannot be changed anymore. I am ready to die, and this is the will of God, and His will be done. After all, I have only saved human beings, even if they were Jews, and this was my death. Just as I have always done everything for other people, I have also sacrificed everything for other people. In the other world, I shall be soon in God's hand. I remain your ever-loving Tony. And an unusually striking example of subterfuge by two army commanders is the incident that took place in Przemysl, Poland in July 1943. There, Army Major Max Liedtke, he's on the left, commander of the city garrison, placed soldiers on a bridge leading into the Jewish ghetto to prevent the SS from staging a raid on the Jewish occupants. His excuse was that he needed a group of 200 Jewish laborers to finish an important military-related assignment and could therefore allow no interference. The SS were forced at gunpoint to withdraw by German soldiers. This incident, scandalous by Nazi standards, reached the desk of the SS head Heinrich Himmler and Hitler's personal aide Martin Bormann, who both decided on punitive measures against the recalcitrant officer and his aide, Lieutenant Albert Butler. Liedtke was relieved of his post and reassigned to a unit seeing action on the Caucasian front. He died in Washington captivity. As for Butler, that is his aide, a co-conspirator in this rescue effort, he was also reassigned, as Butler, in addition, was considered the leading spirit behind Liedtke's action. Himmler ordered that he be placed on trial upon the conclusion of the war. Here is a letter where Hitler writes to Bormann, Lieutenant Bartel, what he did to protect these 200 Jews against the SS at the end of the war will be placed on trial. Of course, the war ended differently than what Hitler foresaw. Some 200 Jews had been spared, but only for a limited time. But some used the additional time allotted them by this to plan their escape. So what you see on the left, you see from a German newspaper when Israel honored Bartel, and before that, you see Major Liedtke died in Washington captivity, but his son came to Yad Vashem, and he was honored, and that's me about to give him the certificate of the righteous Gentile. And then I go to the next story. In Drohobych, Poland, today Ukraine, Eberhard Helmich, a military officer operating a farm for the German army, used Jewish labor from the nearby ghetto and constantly intervened to save them from deportation. When the farm was dismantled in the summer of 1943, he arranged for a dozen Jewish women workers to be sent to Germany disguised as Ukrainians, where his wife Donata, you see on the right, awaited them in Berlin and dispersed them in private homes for domestic assignments. One of the greatest feats in the art of deception practiced by a German official in a high position is that of Hans-Georg Kallmayr. This is Major Helmich. He had moved to New York after the war. In 1966, the Israeli Consul General gives him the Yad Vashem Award here in New York He died in 1969 and is buried here. So the next story is of Hans-Georg Kallmayr. Now, who was he? He headed a section in the Interior Department of the German Occupation Administration in the Netherlands, in Holland, dealing with cases arising out of the Nuremberg laws. More specifically, deciding on doubtful racial cases, such as the status of persons claiming to be of semi-Jewish origin, of one sort or another. Of the 4,780 such cases dealt by him, he decided that 42% were to be considered half-Jews, in other words, Mishlicha first degree, and another 18% one-quarter Jews, Mishlicha second degree. A total of 60% who thereupon were exempt from deportation until further notice, practically speaking in Holland until the conclusion of the war. In disregard of racial guidelines by which he claimed to conform, he made decisions on the basis of the flimsiest of evidence, such as ranking a person as semi-Jewish only on the claim that his real father was a Dutch non-Jew, that is, a full-blown Aryan, since the Dutch were considered by the Nazis as exemplars of pure Aryanism. The petitioner's Jewish mother, so he claimed, had an out-of-wedlock illicit liaison with that man, and therefore he was really a half Jew. Similarly, a person claiming non-Jewish parentage, based on records only available in the far distant Dutch colonies, such as present-day Indonesia, where the claimant was born, and which was unacceptable for verification purposes due to prevailing war conditions in the Pacific area, was declared non or only semi-Jewish and exempt from deportation. Kallmayr added more names to his special list and tried to be of assistance to members of the Portuguese Jewish community who numbered several thousand and who, desperate to avoid deportation, claimed to be of non-Semitic origin, but of Iberian origin, and therefore by Nazi racial definition, not to be linked to the Semitic Jews and to the bitter fate awaiting them. Kallmayr upheld their case, but was overruled by Nazi race experts who, after much procrastination, decided that the Portuguese of Mosaic faith were no less Jewish than their brethren of East European origin. In the end, Karl Mayr was able to save a total of 2,900 lives. To cover his tracks, he had to decline certain petitions for racial reclassifications when these were not corroborated by evidence satisfactory to the eyes of inquisitive and suspicious Nazi inspectors. But he afforded these claimants time to plan alternative safety venues, such as going into hiding. The Karl Mayr story is a clear example of the varieties of subterfuge available to German officials in senior positions for those prepared to use their authority to devise ways and means to save Jews, while at the same time pretending to act in the best interest of the Nazi state. To all intents and purposes, Karl Mayr was implementing Nazi racial definitions stemming from the 1935 Nuremberg laws in an occupied country whose inhabitants were considered a kindred German tribe. In fact, he was perverting these laws in the effort to try saving as many as he could. He succeeded in saving close to 3,000 lives. He too is on the Yad Vashem list of the righteous. In summary, we may draw some conclusions, and these may be summarized as follows. Although helping Jews was a dangerous undertaking everywhere where the Germans dominated, help was possible by Germans from many walks of life and in different circumstances, and some indeed acted that way. Furthermore, the greater the authority exercised by a person, such as Karl Mayr, or of one of having a considerable influence with the authority, such as Schindler, the greater the scope of the rescue operation, and the larger the number of persons saved. German-appointed administrators of expropriated firms utilizing forced Jewish labor could, if they so wished, save their workers, at least for an extended period of time. Beitz, Graeber, Schindler, and Helmisch availed themselves of this opportunity. Turning to most private rescue stories, the rescue operation was preceded by either a long-standing friendship, a close business association, or a gestation period during which a certain familiarity and kinship, at times even collegial intimacy involved, leading to feelings of compassion towards the rescued party, seeing them as fellow human beings in great distress rather than members of an inferior race or a poisonous anti-race to be destroyed for the sake of civilization as claimed by the Nazis. Seeing them not in terms of Jew versus Aryan, but of a German and a fellow human being who, whatever one's prejudiced opinions toward them, had a fundamental right to exist and live as any other human being, and not to be destroyed. Hence, the importance of proximity and eye-to-eye contact between the potential rescuer and the rescued person that served as a trigger for launching the rescue operation. As to the question whether more rescue operations could have been undertaken by Germans and Austrians than the relatively few, the 650 recorded at Yad Vashem, our study does not provide clues how many petitions of help by Jews to non-Jewish acquaintances were recorded or disclosed in the post-war period. And otherwise, how many Germans inside the country and the occupied countries declined help to Jews when challenged to do so. The historical record shows that of the approximate 150,000 Jews remaining in Germany in October of 41, which coincided with the start of the mass deportations, some 12,000 to 15,000 Jews, that is between 8 to 10%, opted for an illegal way of existence, mostly in hiding, but with many unfortunately eventually uncovered by the Gestapo. In Berlin alone, some 5,000 Jews submerged, the German code word U-boat, like submariners, and sought hiding places. 5,000 of these, about 1,400 survived, according to one estimate. The rest were caught by the Gestapo either while on the street or after being informed on. Altogether, some 3,500 to 4,000 Jews survived inside Germany, either in hiding or by passing as non-Jews, and most of these who helped them to survive have not yet been accounted for. We therefore are left with bowing our heads in gratitude to those relatively few who have been identified and acknowledged. This is Karl Mayer. He was dead already, and he was honored as a righteous. And here's the Israeli ambassador, Primor, in Germany, and his ceremony was done in his hometown of Karl Mayer. But we at Yad Vashem, and here you see the Avenue of the Righteous, people like Karl Mayer and others have trees in their name. And this is the medal, which is described, the Talmudic version, whoever saves one life, it is as though he had saved an entire world. So, I have only been able to mention a handful of the many more Yad Vashem Da'anu Rasa. For those relatively few, but significant few, who upheld the image of man as a morally sensitive being, and by defying their own government on a matter of great importance to the Nazi regime, they acted in the best interest of humanity. I'd like to finish with an especially touching story, that of the Catholic prelate Bernhard Lichtenberg, who served as Monsignor in the St. Henrik Cathedral in central Berlin. During the Kristallnacht operation, the pogrom, he was heard saying, "Outside the synagogue burns. That is also a house of God." Then, during the evening prayer in the St. Hedwig Cathedral, Lichtenberg began to pray publicly for both Jews as well as Jewish Christians, and as well also for imprisoned priests. He did that on a daily basis. He also publicly protested against the euthanasia program in a letter addressed to the government chief of doctors, but received no reply. He also challenged Catholic theologian Karl Adam on his espousal of the Nazi state in a spirited exchange of letters with a highly respected theologian. On October 13, 1941, the state finally acted against Lichtenberg after two women reported hearing Lichtenberg praying for the Jews. At his Gestapo interrogation, Lichtenberg declared that "I spiritually oppose the deportation of the Jews." This is on the Gestapo record. "I spiritually oppose the deportation of the Jews with all its consequences because it goes against the chief rule of Christianity. That is," and then he quoted, "you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. And I consider the Jews also my neighbor, who have immortally created souls for the image and likeness of God." Now, I related certain passages to you with that. Have you read my Kampf? What about what the Führer says about the Jews? What's your response? And he said, "I do not consider Hitler as a prophet sent by God. I state with steadfast conviction that the National Socialist ideology is incompatible with the teaching and commands of the Catholic Church." This before an interrogator. On March 21, 1942, Lichtenberg was sentenced to a 2-year prison term. While there, Berlin Cardinal Konrad von Preysing interceded for him on several occasions and wrote to the Pope informing of Lichtenberg's arrest for praying for the arrested Jews. The Vatican, so far as we know, did not intervene. The Gestapo stipulated that if Lichtenberg would remain silent and accept a prohibition on preaching during the wartime, they would allow him freedom upon his release from prison. Lichtenberg declined, stating, "What better can happen to a person than to die for his holy Catholic faith? Today, I am ready to die for it." Upon his release from prison on October 22, 1943, after 2 years in prison, he was immediately rearrested, beaten, and sent to Dachau camp, where he died a week later. His lone clerical outspokenness against the regime on the Jewish issue and his previous aid to Jews in distress merited him to be included on Yad Vashem's list of righteous among the nations. Thank you very much.